Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and my channel simply is called Discerning What is True. Going to be reading from a book by Gerald Massey, what we call a Theosophicus, but he's before what I call Helena Blavatsky's works. I think it's interesting that the two writers that I'm reading from, Gerald Massey and Alvin Boyd Kuhn, which is actually, I think, also before uh, Helena Blavatsky. I think these are key works that is. So I'm going to be reading what is called Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World. It's basically, I think it's in three books, what I call here, and we're going to be starting out at book one. Part of the volume one, I should say, of the book here is to deal with simply sign language and mythology as primitive modes of representation, Taoism, that is tattoos, and fetishism as forms of sign language, elementary and ancestry spirits are the gods and the glorified. And these are books. Okay, so Egyptian Book of the Dead and the mysteries of the Amenida, the sign language of the astronomical mythology, so this is like over 500 pages long. So it's going to take a while to go through this book, but I think it's well worth it. The next section is called the Sign Language of Astronomical Mythology, Part Two, and continue on. But Egyptian wisdom and the Hebrew Genesis, the Egyptian wisdom in other Jewish writings. So let's change some things here. I want to also read something here. That's actually the beginning here at the beginning part of the book. Uh, and he talks about something again. Gerald Massey is someone I've already done readings of his works. So this is what he's talking about. Is a quote here. It may have been 1,000,000 years ago that light was kindled in the old dark land, with which the illuminate scrolls are all aglow. That Egypt gave us with her mummified or mummied hand. This was the secret of that subtle smile inscrutably upon the Sphinx face. Now told from sea to sea, from isle to isle, the revelation of the old dark race. Theirs was the wisdom of the bee and the bird, the ant, the tortoise, the beaver, working human wise, the ancient darkness spake with Egypt's word. Hers was the primitive message of the skies. The heavens are telling nightly of her glory, and for all time earth echoes her great story. This was written in 1907, so it's a little after Helena Blavatsky's work, but again, this is coming from Egypt, so to speak. So we're going to continue. We're going to look into this work. So let's see if we can get this thing to work the way I want it to work. Hold on a second, because I got to change the colors so make it easier for me to read. And so let me bear with that. So bear with me just a second as I move some things around. I have written other books, but this I look on as the exceptional labor which has made my life worth living. Comparatively speaking, quote, a book of the beginnings. This is London in 1881, was written in the dark. Another book he wrote, The Natural Genesis, was written in London also in 1883, was written in the twilight, whereas Ancient Egypt has been written in the light of day. The earlier books were met in England with the truly orthodox conspiracy of silence. Nevertheless, 4,000 volumes have gotten into the circulation somewhere or up or other up and down the reading world, where they are slowly working in the unacknowledged way. Probably the present book will be praised at home in proportion of its comeback comes back preceded from abroad, from Germany or France, or maybe from the country of the rising sun. To all dear lovers of the truth, the writer now commends the verifiable truths that wait for recognition in these pages. Quote, truth is all potent with his silent power. It only whispers, never heard aloud, but working secretly, almost unseen, saved in some excommunicated book. This as the lightning with its errant done before you hear the thunder. For myself, it is enough to know that in spite of many hindrances from straddling circumstances, chronic ailments, and deepening shadows of encroaching age, my book is printed, and the subject matter that I care for most is now entrusted safely in the keepings of John Guggenberg on this my ninth, 97th birthday. So I think he passed away. Let's see what he's got here. Let me make sure I got this. This is 18. I think he passed away early 1900 or something of that nature. Um, Maybe 1907 is what I'm seeing here. So let's continue here. So continue. So let me just continue to go through this. So ancient Egypt, the light of the world. Sign language and mythology as primitive models of representation. This is in book one. The other day, a lad from London who had been taken to the seaside for the first time in his life was standing with his mother looking at the rolling breakers tossing and tumbling in upon the sands when he was heard to exclaim, "Oh, mother, who is it?" chuckling them heaps of water about. This expression showed the boy's ability to think of the power that was doing it in the human likeness. But then, ignorant as he might be, he was more or less the heir to human faculty as it manifested in all his triumphs over external nature at the present time. Now has been, and still is prevalent and practically universal assumption that the same mental standpoint might have been occupied by primitive man, and a like question asked in presence of the same or similar phenomenon of physical nature. Nothing is more common and more unquestioned than the inference that primitive man would or could have asked, quote, "Who is doing it?" End quote, and that the who could have been personified in the human likeness. Indeed, it has become a axiom with modern metaphysical and postulates of the anthropolo- anthropologists that from the beginning man imposed his own human image upon external nature, that he personified its elements, energies, and his fierce physical forces after his own likeness. Also, that this was in accordance with the fundamental character and constitution of the human mind. To adduce a few examples taken almost at random, David Hume declares that, quote, "there is a universal tendency among mankind to uh, conceal, conceive, all beings like themselves," end quote. In support of which he instantly instances the seeing of human faces in the moon. Reid, R-E-I-D, on the active powers, that is fourth essay, says our first thoughts are that, quote, "the objects in which we perceive motion have understanding and power as we have," end quote. Francis Bacon had long before remarked that we, human beings, quote, "set stamps and seals of our own image upon God's creatures and works," end quote. Herbert Spencer argued that human personality applied to the powers of nature was the primary mode of representation, and the identification of this with some natural force or object is due to identity of name. This is from Data of Sociology, chapter 24, page 184. Quote, "In early philosophy throughout the world," says Mr. Taylor, "the sun and moon are alive as it were human in their nature," end quote. Professor Max Muller, who taught that mythology was a disease of language and that the myths had been made out of words which had lost their senses, asserts that, quote, "the whole animal world has been conceived as a copy of our own, and not only the animal world, but the whole of nature was liable to be conceived and named by assimilation to human nature, end quote. That is from quote from Science of Thought, page 503. And quote, such was the propensity in the earliest men of whom we have any authentical record to see personal agency in everything, end quote. That it could not be otherwise, for, quote, there was reality, no way of conceiving or naming anything objective except after the similitudes of the subjected or of ourselves, end quote. And that's same from, again, from the same Science of Thought, page 495. Yeah, 495. Illustrations of this illustrations of this modern position might be indefinitely multiplied. The assumption has been supported by a consensus of assertion, and here, as elsewhere, the present writer is compelled to doubt, deny, and disprove the popular postulate of the accepted orthodox authorities. That said, the line in your version of the story, let us be the sculptural, and for one line on the defeat of a man, you shall see a dozen men beneath the pad of one line. Quote, myth-making man, end quote, did not create the gods in his own image. The primary divinities of Egypt, such as Sut, Sebet, and Shu, three of the earliest, were represented in the likeness of the hippopotamus, the crocodile, and the lion. While Hapi was imagined as an ape, Anu as a jackal, Plot as a beetle, Tot as a ibis, Seth as a goose, so was it with the goddess. They are likeness of powers that were superhuman, not human. Hence, Ap was imagined as a, quote, water cow, Hecat as a frog, Tefnut as a lioness, and Serk as a scorpion, Ranut, Rannut, as a serpent, Hathor as a fruit tree. A huge mistake has hitherto been made in assuming that the myth makers began by fashioning the nature powers in their own human likenesses. Totemism was formulated by myth-making man with types that were the very opposite of human, and mythology, the anthropomorphical representation, was preceded by the whole menagerie of totem zootypes. The idea of force, for instance, was not derived from the thews and muscles of a man, as the Kamite sign language shows. The force that was chuckling them, quote, chuckling them heaps of water about, end quote, was perceived to be the wind, the spirit that moved upon the face of the waters from the beginning. This power was divinized in Shu, the god of breathing force, whose zootype is the lion as a fitting figure of the panting power of the air. The elements audible in the howling wind, but deeply apprehended otherwise, was given shape and substance as the roaring lion in the substitutes of similars. The force of the elements was equated by the power of the animal, and no human thew and sinews could compare with those of the lion as a figure of force. Thus, the lion speaks for itself in the language of ideographic signs, and in this way, the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt were at first portrayed as superhuman powers by means of living superhuman types. If primitive man had projected the shadow of himself upon external nature to shape its elementary forces in his own image, or if the unfeatured vast had unveiled to him any likeness of the human face, then the primary representation of the nature power, which below the latter divinities ought to have been anthropomorphic, that is, and the likeness reflected in the mirror of the most ancient mythologies should have been human, whereas the powers and divinities were first represented by animals, birds, and reptiles, or to employ a word that includes all classes, they were portrayed by means of zootypes. The sun and moon were not considered, quote, human in their nature, end quote, when the one was imagined as a crocodile, a lion, a bull, a beetle, or a hawk, other as a hare, a frog, a ape, or ibis, as they are represented in the Egyptian hieroglyphics by means of the zootypes, until Har the elder Horus, had been defeated as a child in place of the calf or lamb, the fish, or shoot of the papyrus plant, which was comparatively late. There was no human figure personalized in the mythology of Egypt. Primitive, that is, or Paleolithical man was too beggarly poor in possessions to dream of shaping the superhuman powers of nature into human likeness. There is one all-sufficient reason why he did not. He simply could not. And it is precisely because the makers of the myths had not the powers to animate the universe in their own likeness that we have to the zoomorphic mode of representation as the sign language of totemism and mythology. On every line of research, we discovered that the representation of nature was pre-anthropomorphic at first, as we see on going back far enough, and on every line of descent, the zoomorphic passes ultimately into the human representation. Modern metaphysicians, having so developed the faculty of abstraction and the disease of subjectivity that their own mental operations offer no true guidance for generalization concerning primitive or early man, who thought in things and almost apprehended with the physical sense alone. They overlooked the first that imagined by means of object picture preceding the imagining so often ascribed to primitive man. These did not busy themselves and bother their brains with all sorts of vague fancies. Instead of getting an actual grasp of the homeless facts. It was not, quote, primitive man, end quote, but two German metaphysicists who were looking out a window at a falling shower of rain when one of them remarked, quote, perhaps it is I who am doing that, end quote, quote, or I, end quote, chimed in the other. The present writer once had a cat before whom he placed a sheet of polished tin. The cat saw herself reflected as in a mirror, and looked for a short time at her own image. So far as sight and appearance went, this might have been another cat, but she proceeded to apply the comparative process and test one sense by another, deliberately smelling at the likeness to find out if any cat was there. She did not sit down at a non-verifying visionary to formulate hypotheses or conjure up the ghost of a cat. Her sense of smell told her that, as a matter of fact, there was no other cat present. Therefore, she was not to be misled by false appearances, in which she took no further interest. That, we may infer, was more like the actions of primitive man, who would find no human likeness behind the phenomenon of external nature. Indeed, man was so generally represented by the animals that the appearance could be mistaken for a primitive belief that the animals were his ancestors. But the powers first perceived in external nature were not only unlike the human, they were very emphatically and distinctly more than human, and therefore could not be adequately expressed by features recognizable as merely human. Primitive men were all too abjectly helpless in presence of these powers, I should say, to think of them or to conceive them in their own similitude. One primordial and most definite fact of the whole matter was the distinct and absolute unlikeness to themselves. They themselves were too little the cause of anything by the work of their own hands to enter into the sphere of causation mentally. They could only apprehend the nature forces by their efforts and try to represent these by means of other powers that were present in nature, but which were also necessarily superior to the human and were not the human faculties indefinitely magnified. The human being could only impress his own image as an external nature in proportion to his mastery over natural conditions. He could not have figured the quote, thunderbolt as a stone axe in the hands of a destroying power until he himself and made and could wield the axe of stone as the weapon of his own power. But he could think of it in the likeness of the serpent already known to him in external nature as a figure of fatal force. An ignorant explanation of the Egyptian sign language was begun by the Greeks, who could not read the hieroglyphics. It was repeated by the Romans and has been perpetrated by the quote, classical scholars end quote, ever since. But as the interpreter of Egypt, that kind of scholastic knowledge is entirely obsolete. Ignorance of primitive sign language has been and is fertile source of false belief. For example, Julio asked, quote, who does not know what kind of monsters Egypt insanely worship, end quote. And he has it from a quote here. I mean, giving you where it's from SAT. I don't know what that is at 15-1. And having seen or heard of the long-tailed ape in the Egyptian temple, the satirist assumed without question that this animal was set up as an object of worship. He did not know that the ape itself was the worshiper, as an image in sign language and as the saluter of the gods. Anut, the name of the particular ape, denotes the saluter, and to salute was an Egyptian gesture of adoration. The ape, or Cynocephalus, with his paws uplifted, is the typical worshiper as saluter of the light. It was and still is looked upon as in Africa generally as a pre-human moon worshiper who laments and bewails the disappearance of his night light and rejoices at the renewal and return of that luminary. Hor Apollo, that is BI 14, also Captain Burton in a letter to the author. In the vignettes to the ritual, Anuk, the ape is the saluter of the rising sun, SUN, that is of Ra, upon the mountain or the mount of sunrise. One of the most profound perversions of the past has been made in misapprehending this primitive sign language for what is designated, quote, worship, whether as, quote, sun worship, end quote, or, quote, serpent worship, end quote, or, quote, tree worship, end quote, or phallic worship, end quote. The tree, for example, is a type, but the type is not necessarily an object of worship, as misunderstood by those who do not read the types when these are rooted in the ground and natural fact. The forest folk were dwellers in the trees or in the bush. The tree that gave them food and shelter grew to be an object of regard. Hence, it became a type of the mother-earth as the birthplace and abode. Hence, Hathor was the hut or houses of Horus, or heart, H-A-R, in the tree. But worship is a word of cant employed by writers who are ignorant of sign language in general. Some phrases, as, quote, stock and stone worship, end quote, explain nothing and are worse than useless. The mother and the child of all mythology are represented in the tree and branch. The tree was a type of the abode, the roof-tree, the mother of food and drink, the giver of life and shelter, the wet nurse in the quote unquote in the dew or rain, the producer of her offspring as the branch and promise of periodical continuality. Was it the tree then the Egyptian worship, or the giver of food and shelter in the tree? End quote. I'm sorry. Question mark. On the apse steps in the Berlin Museum, two priests are saluting the apse bull. This is the designated, quote, apse worship, end quote. But the apse carries the solar disk betwixt its horns. This also is being saluted, which then is the object of worship. There are two objects of religious regard, but neither is the object of adoration. That is the God in spirit who was represented as the soul of life in the sun and in the tree, also by fumigating bull. In this and a thousand other instances, it is not a question of worship, but of sign language. Nor did mythology spring from 50 or 100 different sources, as frequently assumed. It is one as a system of representation, one as a mold of thought, one as a mode of expression, and all its great primitive primordial types are virtually universal. Neither do the myths that were inherited and repeated for ages by the latter races of men afforded any direct criterion to the intellectual status of such races. A mythical representation may be savage without those who preserved it being savages. When the Egyptians in the time of the Unas, speak of the deities devouring souls, it is no proof of their being cannibals at the time. Mythology has had an almost limitless descent. It was in a savage or crudely primitive state in the most ancient Egypt, but the Egyptians who continued to repeat the myths did not remain savages. The same mythical mode of representing nature that was probably extant in Africa 400,000 years ago survives today among races who are no longer the producers of the myths and Martians than they are of the language itself. The Egyptian mythology is the oldest in the world, and it did not begin as an explanation of natural phenomenon, but as a representation by such primitive means as were available at the time. It does not explain the sun is a hawk, or the moon a cat, or the solar god a crocodile. Such figures of fact belong to the symbolic mode of rendering in the language of animals or zootypes. No better definition of quote myth end quote or mythology could be given than is conveyed by the word quote sem end quote in Egyptian. This signifies representation on the ground of likeness. Mythology then is quote representation on the ground of likeness end quote, which led to all the forms of sign language that could ever be employed. The matter has been touched upon in previous volumes, but for the purposes of completeness, it has to be demonstrated in the present work that external nature was primary image in the pre-human likeness. It was the same here as the external nature. The animals came first, and the predecessors of man are primary in sign language, mythology, and Ptolemism. It's quite certain that if the primitive method had been conceptual and early man had possessed the power to impose the likeness of human personality upon external phenomenon, it would have been in the image of the male as a type or in the types of power, whereas the primitive human personification is in the likeness of the female. The great mother as the primitive parent is a universal type. There could be no divine father in heaven until the fatherhood was individualized on earth. Again, if primitive men had been able to impose the human likeness on the mother nature, the typical, quote, wet nurse would have been a woman, but it is not so. The woman comes last. So she was preceded by the beast itself, that is the sow, the hippopotamus, or Leonidas, and by the female form that wears the head of zootype, the cow, the frog, or serpent, on the body of a divinity. Moreover, the human likeness would of necessity have included sex, but the earliest powers recognized in nature are represented as being of no sex. It is said in the Akkadian, Akkadian hymns, quote, female they are not, male they are not, end quote. Therefore, they were not imagined in the human likeness. The elements of air, earth, water, and fire, darkness and light are of no sex, and the powers first recognized in them, whether as destructive or beneficial, are consequently without sex. So far from nature having been conceived or imagined as a non-natural man in a mask, with features more or less human, however hugely magnified, the mask of human personality was the latest that was fitted to the face of external nature. Masks were applied to the face of nature in endeavor to feature and visible present some likeness of the operative elementary force and manifesting power of air, fire, water, and earth. thunder and lightning, darkness and dawn, eclipse and earthquake, sandstorm, or the drowning waters of the dark. But these masks were zoomorphic, not human. They imagined the most potent of devouring beasts, most cunning of reptiles, most powerful birds of prey. In this monstrous masses, we see the primitive powers of nature all at play as in the pantomime, which still preserves a likeness to the primordial representation of external nature that is now cheaply known under the names of mythology and totemism. The elementary powers operative in external nature were superhuman in the past as they are in the present. The voice of thunder, the death stroke of lightning, the coup de soleil, the force of fire, or of water in flood and in the wind and the hurricanes were superhuman. So of the animals and birds, the powers of the hippopotamus, the crocodile, the serpent, the hawk, the lion, the jackal, and ape were superhuman, and therefore they were adopted as zootypes and as primary representatives of the superhuman powers of the elements. They were adopted as primitive ideographs. They were adopted for use and consciously stamped for their representative value, not ignorantly worshiped. You see, and I think that's what I've thought sometimes. Were they worshiping these things, such and such? But no, these are characteristics they're trying to show. And thus they became the coins, as it were, in the current medium of exchange for the expression of primitive thought or feelings. Sign language includes the gesture sign by which the mysteries were danced or otherwise dramatized in Africa by the pygmies and bushmen in totemism and fetishism and in hieroglyphic symbols, very little of which language has been read by those who are continually treading water in the shadows of the subject without ever touching bottom or attaining foothold in the depths. It is by means of sign language that the Egyptian wisdom keeps the records of the prehistorical past. The Egyptian hieroglyphics shows us the connection betwixt words and things, also betwixt sounds and words in a very primitive range of human thought. There is no other such record known in all the world. They consist largely of human gesture signs and the sounds first made by animals, such as ba for the goat, meow for the cat, soup, su for the goose, and fu for the serrated snake. But the Kamite, represented by means of sign language and begun in Inner Africa before the talking animals, birds, and reptiles had been translated to the forms of gods and goddesses by the dwellers in the valley of the Nile. The living ideographs or zootypes were primary and can be traced to their original habitat and home and to nowhere else upon the surface of our earth. The cow of the waters thus represents the earth mother as the great bringer forth of life before she was divinized as Apt, A-P-T, the goddess in human guise, with the head of a hippopotamus. The overseeing giraffe, or was it the okapa, or soot, the hawk of Horus, the cap ape or tot on the white vulture of Neek, the jackal of Anu, and 50 others were pre-extant as the talking animals before they were delineated in semi-human guise as gods and goddesses or elementary powers, thus figured forth in the form of birds and beasts or fish and reptiles. The zootypes were extant in nature as figures ready model, pictures ready made, hieroglyphics and ideographs that moved about alive, pictures that were earlier than painting, statues that preceded sculpture, living nature types that were employed when there were no other known to art. Certain primordial types originated in the old dark land of Africa. These were perfected in Egypt and thence dispersed about the world. Amongst them is the earth as the solid ground amidst the waters of surrounding space, or as a bringer forth of life, depicted as a water cow, possibly the cow of Kintu in Uganda, the dragon of darkness, and other wide-jawed swallowers of the light that arose up from the abyss and coil about the mount of earth at night as the devourer. The evergreen tree of dawn, preeminently African that is, that rises on the horizon or upon the mount of earth from out the waters of space. The opposing elementary powers, beginning with the twins of light and darkness who fought in earth and in heaven, and the nether world, the great earth mother of the nature powers, the seven children of her womb, and various other types that are one in origin and worldwide in their range. When the solar force was yet uncomprehendable, the sinking sun could be imagined naturally enough by the beetle boring its way down through the earth, or by the tortoise that buried itself in the soil, also by the crocodile making its passage through the waters, or the golden hawk that soared up through the air. This was a representative phenomenon in the external nature on the grounds of likeness, when it could not be imagined directly by means of words. When it was held, as in Australia, that the lizard first divided the sexes, and that it was also the author of marriage, we have to ascertain what the lizard signified in sign language, and when we find that, like the serpent or the frog, it denoted the female, period. We see how it distinguished or divided the sexes, and in what sense it authorized or was the author of totium marriage, because of its being a sign or symbol of feminine publicity. It is said by the Amazulu that when old women pass away, they take the form of a kind of a lizard. This can only be interpreted by knowing the autographic value in the primitive system of sign language in which the lizard was a zootype. The lizard appeared at puberty, but it disappeared at the turn of life, and with the old woman went the disappearing lizard. The frog, which transformed from the tadpole condition, was another iograph of female puberty. This may be illustrated by a story that was told sometime since by Miss Werner, Werner, in the Contemporary Review, which contains a specimen of her primitive thought and its mode of expression in perfect survival. It happened that a native girl at Blantyre Mission was called by her mistress, a missionary wife, to come and take charge of the baby. Her reply was, I can't pronounce this, I'll spell it to you, Nchafuleni is not there. She is turned into a frog. End quote. Werner, that is Contemporary Review, September, that is in page 378. She could not come for a reason of tapu, but said so typically in the language of animals. She had made that transformation which first occurred when the young girl changes into a woman. She might have said she was a serpent or a lizard, or that she was in flower. But the frog that changed from a tadpole was also a type of her transformation, and she had figuratively become a frog for a few days of seclusion. Similarly, the member of the totem also became a frog, a beetle, a bull, or bear as a mode of representation, but not because the human being changed into the animal. The same things which are said in the latter stages by the autographic determinants in the Egyptian hieroglyphics has been expressed previously by the inter-African zootypes, or living beasts, birds, and reptiles, as may be seen in the stories told of the talking animals by the Bushmen. The original records still suffice to show that the physical agencies or forces first perceived were not conceived or mentally embodied in the human likeness, and that external nature offered no looking glass for the human face. To take the very illustration adduced by whom, the original man in the moon did not depend upon any fancy resemblance to the human face. The Egyptian man in the moon, Thoth, or Tuhuti, is Greek thought, and the head of his ibis, or as the Cynocephus, both ibis and Cynocephus were lunar types which preceded any human likeness, and these were continued as heads to the human figure after this had been adopted. The man in the moon, who is Thoth, or Khonsu in Egypt, had a series of predecessors in the dog, or Cynocephalus, the ibis, the beetle, the bull, the frog, and other iconographic figures of lunar phenomenon. As natural fact, Ibis was a famous fisher of the Nile, and his familiar figure was adopted as a zootype of Tot, the lunar god. Where moderns saw the new moon with the Aht moon in her arms, quote, the Egyptians saw the Ibis fishing up the all dark orb from out the waters with the crescent of his curving beak as the recoverist and savior of the drowning light. The moon was not looked upon as having any human likeness when it was imagined as, quote, or by the cat who saw in the dark. The hare that rose up by night and went around the horizon by leaps and bounds, Ibis as the returning bird of passage and messenger of the inundation, the frog that transformed from the tadpole, the old beetle that renewed itself in the earth to come forth as the young one, or the cow that gave rebirth to the child like as her calf. The sun was not conceived as human in its nature. When the solar force at dawn was imagined by the lion face Atum, the flame of its furnace by the fiery serpent Uati, the soul of its life by the hawk, the ram, or the crocodile, which are 5 Egyptian zootypes, and a fivefold disproof of the sun being conceived as a considerable human in its nature as similitude. In the beginning, Avo, our first lesson is to learn something of the symbolic language of animals and to understand what it is that once said as zootypes, we have then to use that knowledge in simplifying the mysteries of mythology. This primitive language is still employed in diverse forms. It is extant in the so-called, quote, dead language, end quote, of the hieroglyphics, the ideographs, and the pictographs, in the Teutonic types and figures of tattoo, in the portrayal of the nature powers which came to be divine laws as linked in the human likeness as the gods and goddesses of mythology, and in that language of the folk fables folk fables still made use of by the Bushmen, the Hottentots, and other Africans, in which the jackal, the dog, the lion, the crane, the white vulture, and other beasts and birds keep on talking as they did in the beginning, and continue more or less to, let's say, in human speech, what they once said in the primitive symbolism. That is, they fulfilled the same characters in the Martian that were first found in the mythos. It has now to be shown how the mythical mode of representing natural phenomena was based upon this primitive system of thought and expression, and how these things that were thought and expressed of old in the language continue the primary stratum of what is called mythology, end quote, today. The most primitive phase, mythology is a mode of representing certain elementary powers by means of living types that were superhuman like the natural phenomenon. The foundation of mythology and other forms of the ancient wisdom were laid in the pre-anthropomorphic mode of primitive representation. Thus, to summarize a few of the illustrations, the typical giant ape was an enormous water reptile. The typical gentrix and mother of life was a water cow that represented the earth. The typical twin brothers were 2 birds or 2 beasts. The typical twin brother and sister were a lion and a lioness. The typical virgin was a heifer or a vulture. The typical messiah was a calf, a lamb, or unbu, the branch. The typical provider was a goose. The typical chief or leader is a lion. The typical artisan is a beetle. The typical physician is an ibis, which administrated the enema to itself. The typical judge is a jackal or a Cyosipsis, whose wig and collar are amusing, suggestive of the English law as courts. Each and all of these and hundreds were preceding personifications in the human image. The mightiest infant who slew the dragon or strangled serpents while in his cradle was a later substitute for such a zootype as the little ichneumon, a figure, I'll spell it, ICH ichneumon, a figure of Horus. The Iguanodon was soon to attack the cobra, Dicapella, and make the mortal enemy hide its head and shield its most vital parts within the protective coils of his own body. For this reason, the lively, daring little animal was adopted as a zootype of Horus, the young solar god, who in his attack upon the apex serpent made the huge and deadly reptile hide its head in its own emulating darkness. But when the figures made anthropomorphic and the tiny conqueror is induced into the little hero in human form, the beginning of the mythos and its meaning are obscured. The intimate, the hog, the ibis might attack the cobra, but it was well enough known that a child would not, consequently the original hero was not a child, although spoken of as a child in the literalized marvels, miracles, and fables of the, quote, infancy, end quote. It is the present writer contention that the wisdom of the ancients was the wisdom of Egypt, and that her explanation of the zootypes employed in sign language, Ptolemism, and mythology holds good wherever the zootypes survive. For example, the Chan tribes say the moon has a frog in it, and with the Salish Indians of Northwest America, the frog or toad in the moon is equivalent to our man in the moon. They have a tradition that devouring wolf, being in love with the frog or toad, pursued her with great ardor and nearly caught her when she made a desperate leap and landed safely in the moon, where she has remained to this day. This is from Wilson, translation of Ethnoc Society in 1866, new series, volume 4, page 304, which means that the frog as a type of transformation was applied to the changing moon as well as to Zulu girl, Nephilinia. Sign language was from the beginning a substitution of similars for the purpose of expression by primitive or pre-verbal man who followed the animals in making audible sounds accompanied and emphasized by human gestures. The same system of thought and mode of utterance was continued in mythology, mythographic, and Ptolemism. Renault says that the Cerberus was a, quote, a object of worship in Egypt, end quote, as a symbol of divinity. But this is the modern era. If there was a god and the beetle was his symbol, obviously it was the divinity that was the object of worship and the symbol, and the symbol as a symbol of divinity. And what this is the modern, okay, it was a symbol. Obviously it was the, divinity that was the object of worship, that was a symbol, not the zootype. Plot, we know, was that divinity, with the beetle as a type. And those who read the types were worshippers of the god and not of the symbolically done beetle, which were honored as a sign of transformation. When told that the Egyptians were worshiping of the bee, the manus, and the grasshopper, we recall the words of Apollo, who says that when the Egyptians would symbolize a mystical, and one of the initiatives they delineated a grasshopper because the insect does not utter sounds with its mouth, but makes a chirping by means of its spine. The grasshopper then, which uttered a voice that did not come from its mouth, was a living type of superhuman power. And being an image of mystery and superhuman power, it was also considered a fitting symbol of Khan, K-A-G-N, the Bushman creator, or great spirit of creative mystery. Moreover, the grasshopper made his music and revealed his mystery in dancing, and the religious mysteries of Kong were performed with dancing or in the grasshopper dance. Thus, the initiatives and the mysteries of the Manus are identical with the Egyptian mystical symbology by the grasshopper, and the dancing probably goes back to the time when pre-verbal man was an imitator of the grasshopper, which was a primitive type of mystery, like the transforming frog and the self-interning Taurus. There is a religious sect still extant that is in England, who are known as the Jumpers, and their salutary exercise still identify them with the leaping, quote, grasshoppers and the praying, quote, praying mantis in the mysteries of old. They still, quote, dance that dance, end quote. The, quote, moon belongs to the mantis, end quote, says the Bushman, which goes to show that the mantis was not only a lunar type as the leaper around the horizon, but on account of his power and transformation. And this again suggests the return why the mantis should be the zootype of the mistake, who transform in trance as well as leap and dance in the mysteries. The frog and the grasshopper were earlier leapers than the hare. These also were figures of the moon that leaped up in a fresh place every night. It was this leaping up of the light that was initiated into the dances of the Africans who jumped for joy at the appearance of the new moon, which they celebrated in the monthly dance, as did the Congo Negroes and other denizens of the dark continent who danced the primitive mysteries, who dramatized them in their dances. The leapers were the dancers, and the leaping mantis, the grasshopper, the frog, the hare, are among the pre-human prototypes. The frog is still known as popular, quote, weather wisdom as the prophesier of rain. As such, it must have been of vastly more importance in the burning lands of inner Africa. And there is reason to suppose that Hecate, the consort of Calm, the king of frogs, was frog-headed as the prophetess, or foreteller on this ground of natural fact. Ertmann says that the, quote, great men of the South, end quote, the privileged conciliatories of the royal orders were almost always invested, I know not why, with the office of prophet of the frog-headed goddess Hecate, end quote. This is from Life in Ancient Egypt, page 82, English translation. The frog was a prophet of rain in some countries and of springtime in others. In Egypt, it was the prophet of inundation. Hence, Hecate was a consort of Crumenon, the lord of inundation and king of frogs. Hecate was also the seer by night in the moon, as well as the crier for the waters and foreteller of their coming. From her as seer in the dark, we may derive the names of the witch as the hex, the hag, the Hagdis, and also that of the dark goddess Hecate. The sender of dreams, as prophetess of rain, or in the inundation, it was the herald of new life to the land of Egypt, and this world be one reason for his relationship to the resurrection. But in making its transformation from the tadpole state to that of the frog, it was a figure of the still more important natural fact. That is, this in the mythology was applied to the transformation and renewal of the moon, and to the transformation of the mortal into a immortal in eschatology, a type of plot, who in one form is portrayed as the frog-headed god. Lamps have been found in Egypt with the frog upon the upper part, and one is known which has the legend Ime Anastasius. I hope I said that right. Quote, I am the resurrection, end quote. That is from Lanzone, Dictionario, page 853, Budge, which is the one who wrote the, it's something to do with the dead. I can't, anyway, it's in the book called, I guess it's his book called, or section called The Mummy, page 266. In this figure, the lamp is equivalent for the rising sun, and the frog upon it is the type of plot, who is in his solar character was the resurrection and the life in the mythology before the image passed into the eschatology in a spiritual sense. The frog was a type of transformation, and the frog-headed plot made his transformation in a mento, to rise again at the opener of the neter earth, as he represented the sun in a mito. The frog, like the Cyanocephalus of Memphis, this is from, looks like RIT dot chapter 42, was imagined as golden. Thus we find the sun, S-U-N, in the lower earth of two depicted in the golden frog, and is stated by, quote, John Bell, the Lammas had the idea that the earth rested on a golden frog, and that when the frog stretched out his foot, there was an earthquake. This is from a quote from a journey from St. Petersburg to Pekin in the year 1719. This is from Pinkerton, Pinkerton, Voyages, Volume 7, page 369. Here, the frog beneath the earth, like the torus, is Egyptian, and as such we can learn what fact and nature was represented by it as a zootype, a plot in the netherworld, called the Earth of Eternity, where the typical tadpole that swam the waters made its transformation into the frog that stretched itself out and set foot on land. It is related in a Chinese legend that the lady, Miss Chang Nigel, attained the drug of immortality by stealing it from Sitwanu, the royal mother of the West. With this, she fled to the moon and was changed into a frog that is still to be seen on the surface of the orb. This is from Denny's Folklore of China, page 117. As Egyptian, the mother of the West was the goddess who received the setting sun and reproduced its light. The immortal liquor is the solar light. This was stolen from the moon. Changnago is equivalent to the frog-headed Hekak, who represented the resurrection. The frog in Egypt was a sign of Midrash, quote, as well as of transformation. In the moon, it would denote Midrash, of renewal, when periodically repetition was a mode of immortality. Hecate, the frog-headed, is the original Cinderella. She makes her transformation into Sati, the Lady of Light, whose name is written with an arrow. Thus, to mention only a few of the lunar types, the goddess Hecate represents the moon and its transformation as the frog. Tot and his Cygocephalus represents the man and his dog in the moon. Osiris represents the lunar light in his character of the hare-headed Nefer, the offspringing hare in the moon. These are Egyptian zootypes to be read wherever found by means of the Egyptian wisdom, among other hieroglyphic signs in the language of animals. The head of a vulture signifies victory, doubtless because of the bird's king's scent for blood. The Shinton claw is a determinant of peaceful actions. The hinder part of the linus denotes the great magical power. The tail of a crocodile is a sign for black and for darkness. An 8 is the allograph of rage and fiery spirit, or spirit of fire. The sparrow is a type of physical evil because of its destructive nature in thieving corn. Its name of tutu signifies a kind of plague or affliction of the fields. The water wagtail is a type of moral evil. This bird, as Wilkerson pointed out, is still called in Egypt the father of corruption, which is called Abu Fazan. It was regarded as the type of an impure or wicked person on account of its insidious suggestiveness of immoral motion. To the extent to which morals and philosophy were taught by means of these living object pictures cannot now be measured, but the moralizing fables spoken as well as acted by the typical animals still offer testimony, and language is full of phrases which continue the zootypes into the world of letters, as when the greedy, filthy man is called a hog, the grumpy man a bear, the cunning one a fox, the subtle and treacherous one a snake. In the folklore of various races, the human soul takes the form of a snake, a mouse, a swallow, a hawk, a pigeon, a beak, a jackal, or other animal, each of which was an Egyptian zootype of some power or soul in nature before there were any representatives of human soul or ancestry spirit in the human form. Hence, we are told that when twins are born, the Batavians believe that one of the pair is a crocodile. Mr. Spencer accepts the quote belief, end quote, and asks, quote, may we not conclude that twins, of whom one gained the name of crocodile, gave rise to a legend which originated the monstrous belief, end quote. This is in a work called Data of Sociology, chapter 22, paragraph 175. But all such representations are mythical and are not to be explicated by the theory of, quote, monstrous belief, end quote. It is a matter of sign language. The Batavians knew as well as we do that no crocodile was ever born twin along with a human child. In this instance, the poor things were asserting in their primitive way that man is born with or as a soul. You see, when you read these things, you begin to grasp some things and say, wait a minute, these people were showing something. And they're not stupid people. They're not. This the Gnostic enabled us to prove one of the earliest types of the sun, SUN, as a soul of life in the water is a crocodile. We see the mother who brings forth a crocodile when the goddess Neith is portrayed in a human shape as the sucker of the young crocodiles hanging at her breasts. Neith is the wet nurse personified whose child was the young sun god. As Sebet, he was imagined by the crocodile that emerged from the waters at sunrise. Sebet was at once the child and the crocodile brought forth by the great mother in mythology. And because the crocodile had imagined a soul of life in water as a superhuman power, it became a representative in sign language of the human soul. We see that the same type of a soul and external nature apply to the human soul in the Book of the Dead. That's what I was trying to think of, the book called Book of the Dead by, now I forgot his name again. Bust, I think it is. No, so in the Book of the Dead, yeah, okay, that's right. A gentleman from England who wrote that book in the late 1800s. When the Osiris in the netherworld exclaims, quote, I am the crocodile in the form of a man, end quote. That is a soul of which the crocodile had been a symbol as soul of the sun. It was thus the crocodile was born with the child. As a matter of sign language, not as a belief. The crocodile is commonly recognized by the Congo natives as a type of soul. Miss Kingsley tells of a witch doctor who administered emetas in certain of his patients and brought away young crocodiles. She relates that a witch doctor had been opened after death when a winged lizard-like thing was found in his inside, which Patana said was his power. The power being another name for his soul. Mr. Spencer not only argues for the actuality of these, quote, beliefs, end quote, concerning natural facts supposed to have been held by primitive man and scientific Egyptians, which vanished with a true interpretation of the mythical mode of representation. He further insists that that there seems to be, quote, ample justification for the belief that any kind of creature may be transformed into any other, end quote, because of the metamorphosis observed in the insect world or elsewhere, from which there resulted the theory, quote, the theory of metamorphosis in general, end quote, and the notion, quote, that things of all kinds may suddenly change their forms, end quote. Man, of course, included. This is from Data, DATA, Chapter 8, Paragraph 55. But there was no evidence throughout all nature to suggest that any kind of creature could be transformed into any other kind. On the contrary, nature showed them that the frog was a tadpole, continued that the chrysalis was the prior status of the butterfly, and that the old moon changed into the new. The transformation was visible and invariable, and the product of transformation was always the same in kind. There was no sign of suggestion of unlimited possibility in a metamorphosis. Neither was there ever a race of savages who did think or believe, quote, in the words of Mr. Spencer, quote, that any kind of creature may be transformed into any other, end quote. No more than there ever were boys who believed that any kind of bird could lay any other kind of bird's egg. They are too good observers for any such self-delusion as that. Mythical representation did not begin with, quote, stories of human adventure, end quote, as Mr. Spencer puts it, nor with human figures at all, but with a phenomenon of external nature that was represented by means of animals, birds, reptiles, and insects, which had demonstrated the possession of superhuman faculties and powers. The origin of various superstitions and customs seemingly insane can be traced to sign language. In many parts of England, it is thought necessary to, quote, tell the bees, end quote, when a death has occurred in the house, and to put the hives into mourning. The present writer has known the housewife to sally forth into the garden with warming pans and a key and strips of crape to, quote, tell the bees, end quote, lest they should take flight when one of their inmates of the house had died. He must seek an explanation for this in the symbolism of Egypt that was carried forth orally to the ends of the earth. The bee was anciently a zootype of the soul, which was represented as issuing forth from the body in that form or under the type. There is a tradition that the bees alone of all animals descend from paradise. In the Engadine, Switzerland, it is said that the souls of men go forth from the world and return to it in the form of bees. Virgil, in the fourth book of the Georgics, celebrates the bee that never dies but descends alive into heaven. That is the typical bee, which was an image of the soul. It was the soul as bee that alone ascended into heaven or descended from thence. The bee is certainly one form of Egyptian abet, or quote, bird fly, which is a guide and pilot to the souls of the dead on their way to the fields of Eru. It was the figure of Lower Egypt as the land of honey, thence a fitting guide to the celestial fields of the Eru paradise. It looks as if the name for the soul, Ba, in Egyptian, may be identical with our word bee. Ba is honey, determined by the bee sign, and Ba is also the soul. The Egyptian made use of honey as a means of embalming the dead. Thus, the bee, as a zootype of the soul, became a messenger of the dead and a mode of communication with the ancestry spirits. Talking to the bees in this language was like speaking with the spirits of the dead, as it were, commending that the party ones to the guidance of the bees, who as honey gatherers naturally knew the way to the Elysial fields and the meads of Amaranth that flowed with milk and honey. The type is confused with the soul when the bee is invoked as follows, quote, almost as a requesting the soul of the party to watch forever over the living, end quote. Gumanos, Zoological Mythical, is volume 2, page 218, and the ritual, the abet as bee or bird fly, is the conductor of souls to the Elysial fields. When the deceased is asked who conducted him thither, he replies, it was the, quote, abet deity who conducted me, end quote. He also exclaims, quote, hail to thee who flies up to heaven to give light to the stars, end quote. This is from chapter 76, Renal. Here the bee or bird fly is a solar type, and that which represents the ascending sun in the mythology became a type of the soul in eschatology. Now, again, eschatology in scripture is considered the study of the last days or last things. And I assume that eschatology might be simply to do with the soul of it being is making either to heaven or eventually coming back here again, reincarnating. That's a theory. Don't trust me on that one. Thus, the inventor of honey in this world led the way to the fields of flowers in the next. Modern popular superstition is a large extent in the ancient symbolism in its second childhood. Here's a case in point. The cock, having been a representative of soul or spirit, is sure to be said that the human soul had entered the cock by a kind of reincarnation. Hence, we read of a legacy left to a vow by a wealthy lady named Silva of Lisbon, who held that the soul of her dead husband survived in the cock. This is in Daily Mail, May 26, 1892. So it has been with the zootypes of other elementary souls that were continued for the human soul, from the crocodiles of Batamians to the red mouse of the Germans, or the folklore is full of fables that originated in this language of signs. The jackal in the Egyptian represented representation is the guide of the sun upon his pathway in Amenta, who takes up the young child, that is Horus, in his arms to carry him over the waters. In the Hottentot prototypes, the jackal finds the sun in the form of a little child and takes him upon his back to carry him. When the sun grew hot, the jackal shook himself and said, quote, "Get down," end quote. But the sun stuck fast and burnt the jackal, so that he has a long black stripe down his back to this day. It's from Blake Renard, page 67. The same tale is told of the coyote or prairie dog who takes the place of the jackal in the mythical legends of the red men. In the ritual, the jackal who carried Horus, the young sun god, has become the hearer and supporter of souls. In passing the place where the dead fall into darkness, the Osiris says, quote, "Aput raiseth me up," end quote. Chapter 44. And when the overwhelming waters of the divulge, burst forth, he rejoices, saying, quote, "Enough is my hearer," end quote. That is from Ritual, I think, RIT, chapter 64. Here, as elsewhere, the mythical type, as since with the earlier Africans, had passed into the eschatology of the Egyptians. The external context betwixt the powers of light and darkness is also represented in the African folk tales. That is, the hare, or rabbit, Kalulu, and the Dizemwi are two of his contending characters. The hare, as in Egypt, is typical of the good power, and no doubt is a zootype of the young upspringing moon. The Dizemi is the evil power, like Apa, the giant, the Ori, the swallower of the waters, or the light. From Werner, quote, "African folklore," end quote. Contemporary Review, September 1896. It is very cunning, but in the end it is always outwitted by the hare. When the Zemwi kills or swallows the hare's mother, it is the dragon of darkness or eclipse devouring the lunar light. The moon mythos is infinitely older than the solar, and the earliest slayer of the dragon was Lunar, the mother of the young child of light. Here she is killed by the Dizimwi. The then Kalulu comes with a barbed arrow with which he pierces the Zimwi through the heart. This is the battle of Ra and Apa, or Horus and Sun in the most primitive form, when we yet the powers were rendered non-anthropomorphical. Again, the monkeys who is transformed into a man is a prototype of the moon god Tot, who is a dog-headed ape in one character and a man in another. A young person refuses several husbands. A monkey then comes along. The beast takes the skin off his body and is changed into a man, to judge from the Egyptian mythos. The young person was lunar, and the monkey changed into a man is lunar likewise. One of the two won the lady of light in the moon. This was the monkey that became a man, as did the bear in Beauty and the Beast, end quote. In another tale, obviously lunar, solar, that is with the sun and moon as the characters, quote, a girl, that is the moon, refused a husband, that is the sun. Thereupon she married a line, that is a solar type. In other words, the moon and the sun were married in a mento. This tale is told with primitive humor. When the wedded pair were going to bed, she would not undress unless he let her cut off his tail. Well, this remained unmathematical when he transformed into the man. Quote, when she found out that he was a lion, she ran away from that husband, end quote. So in the Hindu story, a young woman refuses to marry the sun because he is too fiery hot. Even the American Negro stories of the Beret Rabbit, or Beret Fox, or Beret Wolf, and Beret Terrapin, the original characters of the typical animals are still preserved as they were in the Egyptian mythology when the divine lies. The turtle, or Taurus, the wise and sacrificial one, is the hider. The fox, like the jackal, Anup, is the cunning one. The wolf is the swallower, and the rabbit equates with the hare, a type of good Osiris or of the African Kululu. Any number of current superstitions are the result of ignorance concerning the ancient wisdom, and one of the worst results bequeathed to us by the past is to be found in our customs of cruelty to dumb animals. These poor victims have had to suffer frightfully for the very service which they once rendered to man as primitive types of expression in sign language. In the Persian and Hebrew laws of clean and unclean, many of the animals and birds that were once held sacred in Egypt for their symbolic value are thus condemned as unclean, to be cast out with curses, and so the real animals became the outcasts of the mental world, according to the latter religion, in the language of letters which followed and superseded the Carvedian hieroglyphics in the earlier times. The ass had been a shameful sufferer from the part it played in the primitive typology. Beating and kicking the ass used to be a Christian sport practiced up and down the aisles of Christian churches, the ass being a cast-out representative of the old Hebrew and still an old Egyptian deity. Let's see. I'll probably end here a little bit and take a break. The cat is another sufferer for the same reason. The cat sees by night and was adopted as a type of the moon that saw by night and kept watch in the dark. Now witches are seers and foreseers, and whenever they were persecuted and hounded to death, the cat suffered with them because she had been the type and symbol of predeterminate human sight, predator human sight. These were modes of casting out the ancient fetish images initiated and enforced by the priesthood of the latter fate. In Egypt, as Hor Apollo tells us, the figure of a mouse signified a disappearance. Now, see how crudely the little animal has been treated because it was a type of disappearance. It was, and maybe still, an ancient custom to charm away disease by making a hole in the shrewd ash or witch elm tree and shutting up a live shrew mouse in it. And it's immersing the mouse is in the hole of the tree, the disappearing victim typified or enacted the desired disappearance of the disease. That which has been a symbol in the past is now made use of alive and performing a symbolic action in the present. And so I'm going to take a break here. So it's a little over an hour and 16 minutes I've done this video, I think. Actually, hour and 17 minutes. So this is just the part. This is a brief part of this particular work here, Ancient Egypt, The Light of the World by Gerald Massey, Book 1. What I'm sharing with you simply is looking at the ways they used hieroglyphs and characters, which were animals, in a way to show other things. And unfortunately, most of us don't know this. In fact, I know most of us don't know it at all. So I'm going to stop here at this point, and I want to tell you thank you for being here, and I wish you a good evening, and thank you for listening and being cognizant of the information I'm sharing with you. Again, this is from Gerald Massey. Gerald Massey is a brilliant man. I actually grew up in a very poor home, and eventually became an Egyptologist later on, studying that, and became aware of many deeper things in his life. So thank you again for listening, and you have a good evening. You take care.